So just going back, let's define what you meant by that uncoupling of mitochondria. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so again, long ago when biochemists were trying to work out how many ATP molecules you could get from a molecule of glucose, and they were developing very sophisticated equations to define what went into a mitochondria to produce ATP. There was arguments back and forth between all these distinguished biochemists saying, no, 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 mitochondria produce 34 molecules of ATP. No, 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 in my system, they produce 32 molecules of ATP. And it wasn't until Sir Peter Mitchell from the UK proposed that, in fact, there was an electron transport chain that accomplished this. And his proof was the reason you guys are all getting a different number is that there are these pop-off uncoupling proteins that waste some of the fuel that you guys, don't understand from your calculation. And when these proteins were discovered, everybody says, son of a gun, is that guy a genius? Give him the Nobel Prize. And actually, the story of this man and his tribulations are well worth anybody's reading. He really persevered against huge amounts of criticism, and the guy was right. So hats off to Sir Peter Mitchell. So uncoupling proteins. My world was turned upside down when I discovered a paper by a PhD by the name of Martin Brand, who wrote a paper in the year 2000, not too long ago, that was called simply Uncoupling to Survive. Now, he proposed, and it turns out he was right, and he proved it, is that if you're starving to death and there isn't any food, then the mitochondria, which is the power plant of the cell, has to protect itself at all costs. Because if the mitochondria dies, that's it for us. And so the mitochondria needs to take action into its own hands. And here's the crazy thing. The more the mitochondria feels threatened with survival, with dying, the more uncoupling, the more fuel the mitochondria wastes to protect itself from damage. Now, again, that sounds crazy. If there's not much food to go around, why would you throw food away? It's to protect the mitochondria. And the mitochondria then devotes all of its energy to making more mitochondria to share the workload in making ATP, like adding dogs to the dog sled. And as strange as that concept is, Martin Brand then goes on to show that if you look at super old people who are thriving at 105 years old, they have the most uncoupled mitochondria of anybody. So now you go, whoa, I guess uncoupling mitochondria might be a really good thing to make me live well for a very long time. And fun fact that I talk about in the book, there's a theory of aging that's really called the cost of aging, the energetic cost of aging. And it's been a very popular theory. And briefly, in general, the higher your metabolic rate, the smaller the animal, the shorter the life. And in general, the bigger the animal, the slower the metabolic rate, the longer your life. And it makes really good sense, except birds. Birds are the problem with this theory. Birds in general are small. Birds in general live a very long time. Parrots can live 80 to 100 years. A hummingbird in captivity can live 10 years. And I mean, this is it's got a metabolic rate, sky high. So it turns out that birds have the most uncoupled mitochondria. So even though their oxygen consumption, their metabolic rate is really high, most of it is protectively wasting that energy so that the mitochondria aren't damaged. And more we are beginning to realize that the mitochondrial dysfunction or mitochondrial damage theory of aging and of all really chronic diseases really starts to make sense. So if we can generate within mitochondria these protective mechanisms to keep them safe, to make more of themselves, then it really starts to add up. So this crazy idea that when you're in harm's way, you ought to waste fuel, that Brand said, yeah, that's what you should do. It turns out he was absolutely right. And so when you kind of look at this in a totally different lens, you say, wow, this is actually a really good design. And I certainly wouldn't have done it that way, but now I get it.
This is fascinating. So if the aging process is largely, in a way, related to mitochondria, and as you say, we have, somewhat control over the state of our mitochondria, how much of our sort of health-related fate is up to us then, and how much is out of our hands, would you say?
That's a great question. In my previous bestseller, The Longevity Paradox, there is a very important paper published in Nature just a few years ago that showed that only 8% of our fate is genetically determined, and 92% of our fate is determined by both the fate of our microbiome, the bugs that live in our gut, and these environmental factors like epigenomics. And so I mention that because in this book, I bring up one of the famous twin studies, and twins are identical twins, have the exact same genes. They carry the same DNA. So there's absolutely no difference in their DNA. And yet we know that there are some twins where one is skinny and the other one is fat. And so researchers go, well, wait a minute, these guys have the same genes. They didn't inherit a fat gene from their parents that they shared. What's the deal? So when they actually looked at how their mitochondria were functioning, it turns out the fat twins' mitochondria were what they called lazy mitochondria. And that's not to imply that twin was lazy. That's not what the word means. But they were actually not, if you will, wasting energy. Whereas the skinny twin was the Aston Martin and the other guy was the Toyota Prius. So the other twin was actually uncoupling his mitochondria and wasting energy. That's why he could eat sometimes the same calories as the fat twin and be skinny. And it actually helps to explain why all of us have a friend who seems to eat huge amounts of carbohydrates, eats anything they want, doesn't exercise very much, and is stick figure thin, is twiggy. And then, some of us look at a croissant and gain a pound. And it actually helps to start explaining why, getting our mitochondria to protect themselves and waste energy makes so much sense, and why there are naturally skinny people and why there's fat people.